On my son's birthday, he looked at me and said I was no longer his mother. He didn't shout. He didn't sound angry. He smiled when he said it, as if he were finally relieved to say something he had been holding inside for years. So I smiled back. I turned around, walked away quietly, and let him keep celebrating. 1 hour later, police cars filled my street, and my son learned that some words change lives forever. Before I continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this are shared so we can reflect, learn, and remember our worth, no matter our age. My name is Margaret, and I am 69 years old. I have lived long enough to know that love, when given without boundaries, can slowly turn into permission. But it took my son's birthday for me to finally understand how deeply I had allowed myself to disappear. That morning, I woke before the sun reached the kitchen window. Age has a way of waking you early, even when you no longer have anywhere important to be. My knees protested as I swung my legs out of bed, but I ignored the ache the way I always had. Pain had never stopped me from showing up for my children, and it wasn't going to start now. It was my son Daniel's birthday. 32 years old. I wrapped my cardigan tightly around myself and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house. The walls held decades of sound, laughter, arguments, crying babies, slammed doors, but in the early morning everything felt suspended, like the house itself was holding its breath. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the light. The familiar hum filled the room, comforting and lonely at the same time. This house had been my anchor for more than 3 decades. I bought it with my husband when Daniel was just a baby, back when our dreams were simple, and our backs didn't ache when we stood too long. After my husband passed away, the house became my responsibility alone. Paid the mortgage. I paid the utilities. I paid the property taxes and the insurance. I kept the roof over our heads and the heat on in winter. When Daniel moved back home after college, he said it would only be for a little while, just until he got on his feet. That was 9 years ago. 9 years of groceries. 9 years of late-night takeout with his friends. 9 years of bills quietly paid by me. I never asked him for rent. I never demanded timelines. I told myself he needed support, that the world was hard on young people, that a mother's job was to make life easier for her child. I began baking just after 6 in the morning. I tied my apron the way my mother used to, looping it carefully so it sat just right on my waist. Flour dusted the counter as I measured ingredients slowly, deliberately, following the same recipe I had used since Daniel was a child. The chocolate cake mattered to me. It wasn't just a cake. It was a ritual, a reminder that no matter how old he became, I was still his mother, and this was still how I loved. As the cake baked, the smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine him smiling when he saw it, teasing me the way he used to, pretending he was embarrassed while secretly enjoying the attention. By mid-morning, the cake was cooling on the counter. I stood there smoothing the frosting, even though it didn't need it, fixing tiny imperfections no one else would ever notice. In the drawer beside the stove, 32 candles waited. I had counted them twice the night before, afraid of getting it wrong. On the kitchen table sat Daniel's gift. A leather-bound journal, simple and sturdy. Months earlier he had said he wanted to get his life together, that he felt stuck and needed a fresh start. I believed him because mothers often believe words more than patterns. As the day went on, the house slowly filled with noise. Doors opened and closed. Music drifted in from the backyard. Laughter followed. Daniel had invited people over without telling me. That had become normal. Somewhere along the way, my home had turned into his gathering place, and I had become something like background furniture. By early afternoon, I carefully lifted the cake, balancing it in both hands. The plate felt heavier than it should have, or my wrists were weaker than they used to be. I picked up the gift bag with my free hand and walked toward the back door, planning to surprise him the way mothers do, quietly, proudly, without needing acknowledgement. I stopped just before opening the door. Not because I wanted to listen. 'Cause I heard my name. Someone laughed and said, "Your mom really went all out again." Daniel replied quickly, without hesitation. She always does. That's the problem. My fingers tightened around the edge of the plate. Another voice said, "At least she cares." There was a brief pause. A small opening in the conversation that felt like a breath being held. Then my son said it. The best birthday gift she could give me would be disappearing from my life forever. He said it casually, comfortably, as if it were a harmless joke. Laughter followed. Bottles clinked. Music rose again. The party didn't stop. No one questioned him. No one defended me. I stood there frozen, the cake trembling in my hands. For a moment I thought I might drop it. I didn't. Instead I stepped back slowly, quietly, the way you do when something inside you cracks but you don't want anyone to hear it. 32 years. Fevers in the middle of the night. School lunches are packed before dawn. Doctor visits and parent-teacher meetings. Late-night talks when he was afraid of the dark. Funerals. Graduations. All of it erased by one sentence spoken over beer. I returned to the kitchen and set the cake down gently on the counter. The candles stayed in the drawer. The gift remained untouched. I leaned against the sink and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. Gray hair pulled back neatly. Lines around my eyes shaped by patience, not bitterness. I didn't cry. What hurt most wasn't the cruelty. It was how easy it was for him to say it. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Laughter continued outside. Music played. No one came looking for me. No one wondered where I had gone. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. I realized that disappearing quietly had only taught my son that I would always disappear. That my silence had become permission. That my love, unguarded and unconditional, had slowly erased me. I stood up slowly and walked toward the phone mounted on the wall. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. I knew that whatever came next would change everything. I dialed a number. 1 hour later, sirens cut through the music. Red and blue lights flashed across my curtains, painting the kitchen walls in colors that didn't belong there. And that was only the beginning. The sirens didn't stop right away. They hovered in the distance at first, rising and falling, as if unsure whether they belonged to us. For a few seconds, the music in the backyard kept playing, loud and careless, fighting against the sound of reality approaching. I stood still in the kitchen, my hand resting lightly on the counter beside the untouched cake. The frosting had begun to soften at the edges. The smell of chocolate felt out of place now, like it belonged to another version of the day that no longer existed. Outside voices shifted. Laughter faded into confusion. Someone turned the music down. I heard Daniel say something sharp, irritated, the way he always did when something interrupted his comfort. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I walked toward the back door at the same steady pace I had used all my life when cleaning up messes no one else wanted to face. When I stepped onto the patio, the late afternoon sun caught my eyes. The yard was full of people I barely recognized. Empty bottles sat on tables I had bought years ago. Shoes I didn't know lined the back steps. My home looked like a place I had been renting out to strangers without realizing it. Daniel stood near the grill, his shoulders tense now. His smile was gone. One of his friends pointed toward the street, where red and blue lights flashed faintly between parked cars. "What's going on?" someone asked. Daniel turned toward me, irritation written across his face. "Mom, did you call someone?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was 32, tall, broad-shouldered. His face still carrying traces of the boy who once climbed into my bed during thunderstorms. But the softness was gone. In its place was entitlement, practiced and confident. "I need everyone to leave," I said calmly. The words felt strange in my mouth, not because they were wrong, but because I had waited too long to say them. Few people laughed, thinking I was joking. "Come on, Margaret," one woman said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's his birthday." "This is my home," I replied. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. "And the party is over." Daniel stepped closer to me, lowering his voice the way he always did when he wanted to sound reasonable in front of others. "You're embarrassing me. We'll talk about this later." "No," I said. "We won't." That caught his attention. His friends shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my eyes. Others watched closely, the way people do when they sense drama but aren't sure which side they're on yet. "Everyone needs to leave now," I repeated. Daniel laughed, sharp and humorless. "You can't just kick people out. This is my house too." Something in me settled then. A final piece clicked into place. "This is not your house," I said. "It's mine." The words landed heavier than I expected. Silence rippled through the yard. I saw it register on a few faces. Confusion, calculation, discomfort. Some of them were realizing for the first time that the comfort they had been enjoying belonged to someone else. Daniel scoffed. "You're being dramatic. You always do this." I thought of all the times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. All the times I had swallowed my feelings so he wouldn't feel inconvenienced. All the times I had convinced myself that patience was love. "I'm being clear," I said. "There's a difference." One of Daniel's friends muttered something about things getting weird. Another picked up his jacket. A few people started moving toward the gate, sensing that this situation was no longer entertaining. But Daniel stayed planted, his jaw tight, his pride wounded in front of an audience. "You don't get to do this," he said. "You've never had a problem before." "That was my mistake," I replied. The sirens grew louder. The lights now washed over the far end of the yard, reflecting off the fence and the windows. Someone gasped. "You actually called the police?" Daniel asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "I asked everyone to leave," I said. "They didn't." His eyes narrowed. "You're doing this to punish me." "No," I said quietly. "I'm doing this to protect myself." The first police car pulled up outside. Then another. Doors opened. Radios crackled. The authority in the air was unmistakable, and it cut through the tension like a blade. Two officers entered through the side gate. Their expressions were calm, professional, and practiced. They had seen scenes like this before. Family conflict wrapped in denial, alcohol, and entitlement. "Who's the homeowner?" one of them asked. "I am," I said, stepping forward. Daniel turned sharply toward me. "Mom." "Margaret," I corrected him gently. "My name is Margaret." The officer nodded at me. "Ma'am, did you ask these guests to leave?" "Yes," I said. "Multiple times." The officer turned to the group. "Everyone needs to exit the property now." Most of them moved quickly then. Embarrassment has a way of motivating people when authority enters the picture. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered apologies they should have offered long ago. But Daniel didn't move. "I live here," he said stubbornly. "She can't kick me out." The officer looked at him carefully. "Sir, do you own this property?" Daniel hesitated. "No, but..." "Then you need to leave," the officer said evenly. Daniel laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. "You're not serious." "I am," the officer replied. I watched my son struggle with the idea that consequences applied to him. I saw confusion flicker into anger, anger into fear, and fear into defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "This is ridiculous." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Sir," he said, his voice firm now. "This is your final warning." The yard had emptied almost completely. A few people lingered at the edges, watching from a distance, their curiosity overpowering their common sense. The grill still smoked quietly, forgotten. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, as if expecting me to rescue him, to smooth things over, to make this go away the way I always had. I didn't move. I didn't speak. For the first time in his life, I let him stand alone. The officer stepped forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Daniel's face drained of color. "You can't be serious." "I am," the officer said. The click of handcuffs echoed across the yard, sharp and final. Something inside my chest tightened, not with regret but with grief. Not for what I had done, but for how long it had taken me to do it. As they led him toward the patrol car, Daniel twisted his head toward me. His eyes burned with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he said. I met his gaze calmly. "I already regret waiting so long." The car door closed. The engine started. The red and blue lights flared once more before fading down the street. I stood alone in my yard, surrounded by empty cups, overturned chairs, and the quiet aftermath of truth. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of what I would do next. The police car disappeared down the street, its lights fading until the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet. What remained behind was a silence that felt heavier than the sirens ever had. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and forces you to breathe slowly, deliberately, just to stay steady. I stood on the patio for a long moment after they were gone. The grill still smoked faintly. A paper plate lay overturned near the fence, smeared with sauce. Someone had left a jacket draped over the back of a chair, as if they planned to return for it later, unaware that this day had already drawn a line through everything. I didn't rush to clean up. For once, I allowed the mess to exist. The officers had told me where they were taking Daniel. County jail. Temporary holding. They spoke gently, professionally, as if they understood that even when consequences are necessary, they still hurt. I nodded and thanked them. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, calm and polite, the way I had learned to be in moments of crisis. When the last patrol car was gone, I walked back inside the house and closed the door. The click of the lock echoed through the kitchen, louder than it should have been. I leaned my back against the door and closed my eyes. I felt tired in a way sleep could never fix. The cake still sat on the counter, untouched. The frosting had softened, the edges no longer neat. I looked at it for a moment, then carefully lifted it and placed it in the refrigerator. Not because I planned to eat it later, but because throwing it away felt too final for something that had taken so much care. I moved through the house slowly, picking up cups, folding stray napkins, and opening windows to let the smell of smoke and alcohol drift out. Every step felt deliberate, grounding. I needed the rhythm of movement to remind myself that I was still here. As evening settled in, the house felt different. Quieter, yes, but also clearer. Like a fog had lifted and revealed damage I had been pretending not to see. I sat at the kitchen table and folded my hands in front of me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Daniel to come home, to ask for something, to complain about something, to need something. He was gone, and whether I liked it or not, the space he left behind forced me to confront the truth I had avoided for too long. I had raised a son who believed consequences were optional. That night, sleep came in fragments. I woke often, listening for footsteps that never came. Each time I opened my eyes, I remembered where Daniel was, and a strange calm settled over me. Not relief, not satisfied, just acceptance. The next morning the phone rang just after 9. It was the county jail. They confirmed what I already knew. Daniel would be held for a minimum of 14 days. Trespassing. Failure to comply with a lawful order. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just the kind of charges that come from believing rules don't apply to you. 14 days. When I hung up the phone, I sat very still. 14 days was not a punishment. It was time. Time I hadn't had in years. Time to think without interruption. Time to look at my life honestly. Time to decide what kind of woman I would be when Daniel comes back. I made coffee and carried it to the living room, where sunlight streamed through the curtains. Dust floated lazily in the air, visible now that the house was quiet. I realized how rarely I sat in this room without distraction. It had always been Daniel's space. His television, his games, his noise. I looked around and saw the truth clearly for the first time. This house did not feel like mine anymore. I spent that day going through drawers and cabinets, not cleaning, just observing. I found unpaid parking tickets in Daniel's name. Old mail I had been meaning to ask him about. Half-finished projects are abandoned without thought. Everything pointed to the same pattern. Responsibility deferred, always assumed someone else would handle it. Someone else had been me. By the third day, neighbors began to ask questions. Some offered sympathy. Others offered opinions. I listened politely and shared very little. This wasn't something that could be explained in a sentence or defended in conversation. It was something that had to be lived through. On the fourth day, I opened the filing cabinet in my bedroom. That was the day everything truly shifted. Inside were years of documents. Mortgage statements, tax records, insurance policies, bank statements. I spread them across the bed and began reading carefully, the way my husband and I used to when making important decisions. Numbers have a way of telling the truth when people won't. I calculated what it had cost to support Daniel for 9 years. The utilities, the groceries, the insurance, the repairs, the little emergencies that always seemed to appear at the worst times. The total stunned me. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I had never asked myself if I should. That evening, I stood in the doorway of Daniel's room. The bed was unmade. Clothes lay in careless piles. Empty soda cans cluttered the desk. It looked exactly like it always had, frozen in a state of unfinished adulthood. I didn't feel anger. Felt clarity. By the end of the first week, I had made a decision, though I hadn't spoken it aloud yet. I needed to test it, to sit with it, to see if it felt right when the house was quiet and my thoughts had nowhere to hide. On the 7th day, I visited the jail. Not to see Daniel. To confirm his release date. The building was stark and impersonal, designed to strip emotion from the process. The officer behind the desk checked the records and looked up at me. 14 days, he said. Release is scheduled for the morning of the 29th. I thanked him and walked out without another word. 14 days. Enough time to end one life and begin another. That night, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. I thought about all the nights I had stayed awake worrying about Daniel's future, about whether he would ever find his way, about whether I had failed him somehow. The truth settled over me gently but firmly. I hadn't failed him by loving him too much. I had failed myself by loving him without limits. As the second week began, I started to plan. Not in anger. Not in secrecy. But with the calm precision of someone who finally understood that boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. By the time Daniel's release date circled on the calendar, I knew exactly what I was going to do. And I knew he would never see it coming. The morning after I circled Daniel's release date on the calendar, I woke with a strange sense of calm. Not the fragile calm that comes from denial, but the steady kind that arrives once a decision has been made and accepted. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching steam rise from the mug. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel hollow. Felt purposeful. Like a pause between two chapters of a life that had been running on the same page for far too long. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window. From there I could see the street, the mailbox, the familiar stretch of pavement where Daniel used to wait for the school bus. Everything outside looked unchanged, but I knew better now. Appearances have a way of lying. I began that day by making a list. Not a dramatic one. Just simple, practical steps written in neat handwriting on a yellow legal pad. Years ago, my husband used to say that if you wanted to understand a problem, you had to break it down into pieces small enough to handle. I found comfort in that method now. The first item on the list was the house. I had avoided thinking about it for years, telling myself that it was Daniel's home too, that it wouldn't be fair to uproot him. But fairness, I had learned, cannot exist where respect is absent. This house represented my labor, my sacrifices, my responsibility. And it had slowly turned into the stage on which my own erasure played out. By mid-morning I had called a real estate agent. Her name was Linda, and her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had helped many people close chapters they thought would last forever. She scheduled a visit for the following afternoon. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment, letting the finality of that decision settle. I didn't cry. Felt relief. Over the next few days, I moved through the house with a different awareness. I noticed things I had stopped seeing years ago. The scuff marks on the walls. The worn edges of the kitchen counters. The places where time had passed, whether I acknowledged it or not. I began sorting through Daniel's belongings, carefully and respectfully. I boxed his clothes, his books. The things he had scattered throughout the house without ever considering permanence. I labeled each box neatly. Not out of spite but out of order. The order felt important now. Every so often I would pause, holding something that carried a memory. A childhood trophy, a faded photograph, a handwritten note from a school project. In those moments, grief would rise quietly in my chest. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just present. I let it pass without fighting it. Love doesn't disappear just because boundaries appear. When Linda arrived, she walked through the house slowly. Her practiced eye noting details I had long since taken for granted. She complimented the layout, the light, and the care I had taken over the years. I nodded politely, listening without emotion. "It's in very good condition," she said. "Homes like this don't stay on the market long." I knew that already. We talked numbers, timelines, and possibilities. I asked direct questions and accepted honest answers. By the time she left, the plan was clear. The house would be listed within days. If all went well, it would sell quickly. Time was aligning in a way that felt almost intentional. Each night I checked the calendar. Each morning, I woke with the same steady resolve. Daniel had not called. The jail had offered visitation hours, but I declined. This wasn't about punishment or silence. It was about clarity. I needed him to experience the consequences of his choices without my interference. By the end of the first week, the house was officially on the market. The sign went up quietly, without ceremony. I watched from the window as it was placed in the yard. For a moment my chest tightened. 30 years of life stood behind that door. But grief, I was learning, does not mean regret. People began to walk through the house. Strangers with careful steps and curious eyes. They admired the space, the light, the yard. They imagined futures that didn't include my son or my sacrifices. That felt right. Offers came in faster than I expected. Some were tentative, others confident. Linda called me each evening with updates. Her voice carrying a professional excitement that contrasted with my own quiet acceptance. On the 9th day we accepted an offer. It was clean, direct, no complications. The closing date was set for the morning after Daniel's release. I sat with that information for a long time, letting its weight sink in. The timing felt almost unreal, as if the universe itself was drawing a line between what had been and what would no longer be. That night I wrote a letter. I didn't rush it. I didn't dramatize it. I wrote simply, clearly, and honestly. Every word was chosen with care. This was not a goodbye meant to wound. It was a boundary meant to stand. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside an envelope. I wrote Daniel's name on the front in the same handwriting I had used on permission slips and birthday cards for decades. The next morning I packed a single suitcase. I chose only what I needed. Clothes, personal papers, a few photographs, and the small things that made me feel like myself. I left behind objects that belonged to another chapter of my life. Letting go felt lighter than I expected. On the 12th day, the house was almost empty. Echoes filled the rooms where laughter and arguments once lived. I walked through each space slowly, saying quiet goodbyes to moments rather than walls. When I reached the front door, I rested my hand on it and took one last breath. I was not running. I was leaving with intention. The night before Daniel's release, I stayed with a neighbor I trusted. I didn't tell many people where I was going or why. Some journeys don't need witnesses. In the early morning, I stood by the window and watched as moving trucks arrived at my old house. The new owners were young, hopeful, and excited. They waved politely, unaware of the history they were inheriting. Smiled back. By the time Daniel stepped out of the jail that morning, the house he expected to return to no longer belonged to him. And the letter waited. I watched from across the street, standing just far enough away to remain unseen. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint smell of fresh coffee from somewhere nearby. I held my coat closed with one hand, not because I was cold, but because I needed something solid to remind myself that I was real, that this was happening, that I was not dreaming. Daniel came down the sidewalk slowly. He looked smaller than I remembered. The confidence he usually carried was gone, replaced by something uncertain and raw. His clothes hung loosely on him, the same ones he'd been arrested in, wrinkled and tired. In his hand was a small plastic bag containing the few things the jail had returned to him. He walked with the expectation of familiarity, the way someone walks when they believe they know exactly where they're going. I had seen that walk for years. He reached the front of the house and stopped. At first, confusion crossed his face. He checked the address, glanced up and down the street, then looked again at the house. The sign was gone, but the changes were unmistakable. New curtains hung in the windows. A different car sat in the driveway. Boxes were stacked near the garage. Daniel stepped closer to the door. A man opened it. They spoke briefly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the exchange clearly. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. His voice rose slightly. The man shook his head and gestured inside, then handed Daniel an envelope. The envelope I had written. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, staring at it as if it might explode in his hands. Then he tore it open. I leaned slightly against the tree beside me, my heart steady but heavy. This was the moment everything I had planned, everything I had feared, everything I had accepted would finally reach him. I watched his face as he read. Confusion gave way to disbelief. Disbelief softened into panic. Panic collapsed into something quieter, heavier. He read the letter again, then a third time. His knees buckled slightly, and he sat down on the curb, the envelope slipping from his fingers onto the pavement. The plastic bag fell beside him, its contents spilling out. Keys that no longer fit any locks, a wallet that felt suddenly too light, a phone he didn't know who to call with. I closed my eyes for a moment. This was the part no one ever talks about when they celebrate consequences. The moment when justice arrives not with shouting, not with triumph, but with silence. I remembered the words I had written, every one of them still clear in my mind. Daniel, you said you wanted me to disappear from your life. I have chosen to honor that wish. The house has been sold. I am leaving to begin the life I postponed for too long. You are free now. Nothing cruel. Nothing dramatic. Just the truth. Daniel pressed his hands into his face. His shoulders began to shake. I saw his chest heave as the reality settled into his bones. He wasn't crying loudly. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. He was grieving. For the first time in his life, there was no one to soften the landing. I stood there longer than I probably should have, watching him sit alone on the curb of a life he had taken for granted. Watching him finally feel the weight of his words, his choices, his entitlement. I didn't feel satisfaction. Felt sadness. Not the sharp, cutting sadness of betrayal, but the deep, quiet sadness of understanding that love does not guarantee gratitude, and patience does not guarantee respect. A woman stepped out of the house and spoke gently to him. I saw her offer him water. He shook his head. She nodded respectfully, then returned inside. I was grateful to her. Not for helping him, but for showing me that kindness can exist without obligation. After a while, Daniel stood up. He picked up the envelope and folded it carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. He looked around one last time, his eyes lingering on the house, the yard, the space that had once held everything he thought was permanent. Then he walked away. I stayed where I was until he turned the corner and disappeared from view. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. I returned to my neighbor's house quietly. My suitcase waited by the door, exactly where I had left it. Everything I own now fit into that single case. Strangely, it felt like more than enough. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel like someone who had lost a home. I felt like someone who had reclaimed herself. The drive away was peaceful. The road stretched ahead, open and unfamiliar. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't rush. I let the silence ride with me, comfortable now, no longer heavy. I thought about the woman I had been for most of my life. The mother who stayed quiet to keep the peace. The wife who held things together when no one noticed. The grandmother who gave and gave until there was nothing left but patience. I wasn't ashamed of her. She did the best she could with what she knew at the time. But she wasn't who I was anymore. By the time I reached the coast, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. The water stretched endlessly, steady and unbothered by human mistakes. I parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the salt air. For the first time in years, no one needed anything from me. That realization felt strange. And then it felt freeing. I found a small place to stay, modest and quiet, where the mornings were slow and the evenings belonged to the sound of waves. I unpacked my suitcase and placed my belongings carefully, intentionally. Each item felt lighter now, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive at this version of myself. Days passed, then weeks. I thought of Daniel often. Not with anger, not with regret, but with a steady hope that one day, he might understand that boundaries are not abandonment, and consequences are not cruelty. I didn't know where he went. I didn't know what he chose next. And for the first time that was okay. Some lessons must be lived without witnesses. I walked along the shore one morning, my shoes in my hand, the cool water brushing my feet. I realized then that disappearing does not mean becoming nothing. Sometimes it means finally becoming someone. I am still a mother. But I am also a woman who learned, perhaps late, but not too late, that dignity matters. That love must be balanced with respect. That giving endlessly is not the same as loving wisely. My name is Margaret. I did not vanish. I stepped forward. And I am still here,